much, Sarah, and it is so incredible to be here. I mean, 5,000 people working on climate tech. You people give me hope. For the past 35 years, I've been working on environmental policy and climate policy, trying to figure out how social change is made, where power lies. My journey started here in the old-growth forests in Canada, the place of my heart. And along the way, I developed some campaigns to encourage companies and governments to make the changes that we need to make at the pace that we need to make them. I've run a lot of corporate campaigns over that time. And one of the most important things that I realized in doing those campaigns, this was a campaign I ran a long time ago. At the time, Victoria's Secret was producing 1 million catalogs a day out of Canada's old-growth forests. And during that campaign, I realized, of course, that there are good people everywhere. There are good people stuck in some really bad systems. And a lot of the people that we need to make the changes that we need to make today are still stuck in those systems, in those extractive industries. So when I started working on climate change in the Alberta tar sands, one of the belly of the beasts, I decided to sit down and meet with the oil companies to try and understand what they were thinking, to see if we could find some common ground. And we did. After several years of discussions with the CEOs of the 5 major oil companies, we were able to come to agreement on climate policy in Alberta. This is a region that had never had a climate policy before, never had a climate plan before, and it was even hearsay. I remember when I first started working in Alberta, meeting with a minister, and as we were walking into the legislature, I said something to her about climate change, and she said, "Oh, don't say that word here until we get into my office and it's private." So we reached an agreement for a climate plan. We stood on the stage, we announced it. We had reached agreement on carbon pricing, on an emissions cap in the oil sands. After the cameras were off, the companies backtracked. They lobbied against the legislation. They ensured that a new government was put in place who immediately eliminated the legislation. They ran ad campaigns fear-mongering on price and scarcity. And I started looking globally at what these companies were doing, because I learned a lot in those discussions. There are some really good people in the fossil fuel industry. And I think some of the people that I worked with were horrified to see what their companies were doing after the fact, after we had reached those agreements. And what I found is, although the companies are talking a good game and spending, in some cases, over 80% of their budget on their ads about how they're becoming energy companies, how they're investing in renewable energy, for the most part, the industry is investing about 1% in renewable energy and 99% in growing more oil, gas, and coal. When we look at how much they're spending lobbying, there's lots of data now from Influence Map and others that is showing us that these companies are successful in weakening climate policy at every level of government and internationally. When you add up what they're spending on advocacy, on their public relations, and not just their lobbying, it's in the billions. One study that was done in Canada looked at how many meetings are the companies having with the government. 11,000 meetings in 7 years, about 6 meetings a day between oil executives and our government officials. One of the most, I think, horrendous things I discovered was that the companies are promising technologies to clean up oil and gas, to reduce emissions, carbon capture and storage. But when you look at their success rate over the years versus their projections and their promises, it's not working. It's not working at scale, yet they're continuing to make these promises, and those promises are being baked in to our plans, our legislations, and the billions they're getting from our governments. So why does this matter? It matters because 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from 3 things: oil, gas, and coal. And those emissions that are trapped, of course, are what's creating the fires, the floods, and the storms, and the heat waves sweeping our planet. In fact, the Paris Agreement, the world's climate agreement, it doesn't even include the words fossil fuels, or for that matter, oil, gas, or coal. Because the fossil fuel industry has been successful in making itself invisible. Right now, we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal between now and 2030 than we can ever burn, or it will burn us. In fact, if we produce that much, it puts us on track, not for a 1.5-degree world, which is our goal under the Paris Agreement, not even for a 2-degree world, but for a much hotter world. So how is this happening? Because climate policy has been designed on a theory that the price for renewables and battery storage and other technologies will go down, demand will peak and go down, and the markets will constrain supply. So we've been working, and our governments have been negotiating on emissions and targets, but allowing production to increase. And the fact is, that theory's not working. Why? In part because we're giving $7 trillion a year in public money to the oil and gas and coal industries. That's about $11 million a minute in subsidies. So where are we today? We have pledges to about 1.5, our goal is 1.5. And pledges a little over 2. Current policies will take us a little over 3 degrees. Where are the oil companies? If you look at their plans, they're planning production levels that are equivalent with a 3 to 4 degree world, not exactly net zero. So emissions are, of course, going up, but we need to get to a 45% reduction by 2030. How do we do that? We know what we're currently living in my country alone in Canada this summer. The fires lasted for 5 months. You could fit 50 countries into the area burned in Canada this year. And of course, tens of thousands of people lost their home, and around the world, millions of people lost their homes and their lives. The IEA reports that there's no need for new fossil fuel investment. And of course, civil society, indigenous leaders around the world have known this for decades and have been marching, saying, keep it in the ground. But there hasn't been a pathway for how we constrain fossil fuel production. We keep negotiating with fossil fuel companies, helping them with your technologies. We need to stop negotiating with them and start regulating them. They're not going to manage their own decline. And the bottom line is that it's not a transition if we're continuing to grow the problem. So what do we need to do? Around the world, a group of people are now coalescing around an idea for a companion agreement to the Paris Agreement, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. It's a hard word to say. You can just call it fossil fuel treaty. The fact is, we need to stop the expansion, and we need governments to cooperate to do that. We need to manage a wind down of production along with the wind down of demand. And we need to do that in a way that is equitable and fair, because there are countries right now that are drilling for oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. And we need to manage a just transition in a way that's fair and financed. So some say this is too big. It's going to take too long. We can't, but the fact is, we can't afford more of the same. And we know when we study landmines or chemical weapons bans or other treaties that at the point that countries propose it in the floor of the United Nations, it can be swift to create a new treaty. And no, some countries may never join, but they didn't join the landmine treaty either, or the nuclear treaty for that matter. But the journey matters, and we shifted what is acceptable. Already, 8 countries have proposed the fossil fuel treaty on the floor of the United Nations, including and led by countries in the South Pacific that are facing the worst of the disaster today in Vanuatu, yet another cyclone. But the good news is this movement is growing around the world. We have over 3,000 scientists that have joined the fossil fuel treaty, close to 1 million individuals, almost 100 cities, including LA, and many cities around the world who are endorsing the fossil fuel treaty. We have thousands of civil society organizations, and we've just started our business program. So remember right now, how you choose to spend your time and with whom is critical. Clean tech can't clean up fossil fuels. Right now, we already have enough oil, gas, and coal under construction to take us past 2 degrees. And there are many companies, some of you are here, who are working with companies like Exxon Their use of AI will allow them in the Permian to expand to an increase of 50,000 barrels a day more with AI tools. And the US is already the largest expander of fossil fuels, oil and gas planned in the next 5 years. More oil and gas is planned to expand in the US than anywhere else in the world. Between now and 2050, close to 50% of everything planned is in the wealthy countries. So I know this is hard. This work is difficult. And these conversations are challenging. But we can't continue to spend our financial, our political, our intellectual capital on building more of the problem. Every ton of carbon right now that we save from going into the atmosphere will save lives. So use your time wisely. Use your companies wisely and join us, because together we're so much more powerful than apart. It does take courage and hard conversations, but the great thing about courage is that courage is contagious. Thank you.